welcome back to the Found in Translation radio show and podcast here at WPPMLP Philadelphia, 106.5 FM in the city that loves you back. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for joining our podcast listeners. You can download and subscribe Found in Translation podcast version. Anywhere you can download a podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, the list goes on and on. Joining me on this sort of kickoff to the summer edition of Found in Translation radio show and podcast, one of my dear compadres and political analyst, Elbert Garcia. LB, welcome back, brother. It's been too long.
Good to be on the show, Ray. Good to be on the show.
What people don't realize is that we basically do the show 6-7 days a week. We just don't tape it because we always have so much conversation about these topics. Later on in the show, we're gonna break down sort of the field. The debates are coming. LB, in your hometown in Miami, or your new hometown, they are coming. So we're going to break down what our thoughts are around sort of how the 2-day field is going to break down. We're going to talk about some good news coming out of the Big Apple, LB's original hometown. And speaking of the Big Apple, Miami baller shot callers, we have to talk a little bit about what happened in Santo Domingo a few years ago. LB, the ongoing novela of the Big Papi saga just goes on and on. And I'm gonna ask my Dominican compadre his thoughts on the various theories that have been coming out about this drama. LB, mejor que Netflix, this drama. I mean, I hope of course, our thoughts on President Big Papi, but the story is getting juicier and juicier by the day.
This is like if Oliver Stone wanted to create a novela, like all the things would be in play over here.
No question. And later in the show, you're actually going to hear in a little bit, we actually interviewed Latina Democratic strategist Nicole Rodriguez. Nicole was actually on the ground as a counter-protester to the Trump rally that took place as formal kickoff of his campaign. It happened in Orlando early this week. So we're going to have Nicole kind of give us a bird's eye view of what the vibe like was on the ground and her thoughts a little bit about the Latino vote in Florida, another subject close to Elbert Garcia's heart. LB, but let's start with sort of the story that I'm not going to stop talking about because I think it's clearly an incredible moment in our history where we have literally tens of thousands of young people incarcerated on our southern border, many of which came with their families for applying for legal asylum. But nevertheless, 6 have passed away. There's reports of just inhumane conditions. Apparently, the federal government is now saying we don't need to authorize. They don't need soap or toothpaste. So this is just inhumane conditions any way you slice it. But unfortunately, the major headlines that came out of this tragedy, instead of people discussing the horrific nature of what our country is implementing against these poor children and families, is criticism, and not just by the right, but primarily by the right, of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, equating the conditions that these people, especially these young people, are in on our southern border in these facilities to concentration camps. Elbert, can you share with people a little bit about your perception of kind of how, about how this story's played out in the media? It's a shame that people are focusing on wordsmithing when they should be focusing on the real tragedy that's happening on our southern border.
Well, I think what we're seeing here is a classic case where you've got somebody who is a lightning rod, for the right, somebody who's eloquence about what she believes in, and AOC is pretty clear, right, about not just from where she's from in terms of the Bronx, but also she's very clear about what her values are, and very clear about expressing herself in that way. Here she goes, just merely retweeting what other people have said, right? What other scholars have talked about in terms of the way that the immigrants coming across the border, and specifically the children, how they're being held, how they're being separated from their families, the increasing cruelty that we see going on, and how that just seems to be almost like a preview or it's almost like the early stages of what may have happened in other stages of history. She's not the first one to say that, right? And she's not the first one to say that this looks like the beginning of concentration camps. and yet she is being criticized, I think, in a very partisan way. You've seen other Democrats, folks who have no problem calling out what they see as potentially anti-Semitism on the left. Folks like Jerry Nadler and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, all those folks there, standing up, standing with AOC. You see left Jewish organizations like like Bend the Arc, talking about that. Again, people are wordsmithing and getting into kind of whether or not she said the right word. There's also this kind of political discussion saying, well, she shouldn't have used it, or this makes us look bad. And at the end of the day, what's going on is as much of a moral crisis as it is a life and death crisis at these places, right? The truth is that yes, there is increased refugees who are trying to come to the United States. Yes, it's true that they have, by virtue of their human existence and the fact that we are one of the co-signers to, in terms of general standards that the UN has set about refugees and people who are seeking asylum, these folks, these, parents, children, families who are coming across have a right to be heard. And so they don't have a right, to be treated as such, and they're being held, without, in detention, without trial. There are some places where they are getting minimal standards. There are also a lot of places, including down here in Florida, in Homestead, where they are not getting treated correctly, where they are sitting on cold floors, where they are being separated, as we're used. And again, the administration is making the argument that things that we see as just basic human, just basic ways in which you treat humans, that they don't have to treat them.
We don't treat our standard criminals this way. We don't treat prisoners of war this way because there's international standards around those issues.
But this is the thing,
and so it's a dehumanization of these people in particular, particularly since they didn't commit a crime. Well, in many instances, they're actually applying through legal means.
Well, this is the thing. This is the dehumanization process, right? Is where some people, again, there are some people, and again, it's not just. I think you're right in that. Let's kind of break the stereotype of folks who are thinking. There are lots of Latinos. There are lots of Latinos who consider themselves law and order. Latinos who feel like, well, there's so much incentive for the undocumented to cross the border that what you have to do is to give a little bit of tough love. And if folks know that they're going to be treated like crap, then they won't come over, right? But people don't get
it. Well, that hasn't helped. It actually has increased.
Well, the data doesn't say it that way. But the other thing too is that it totally negates the fact that what's going on, what people are escaping, is just as bad, if not worse. Right. And so people are under no delusions, right, that trying to get to here is going to be a difficult task. Right. And most people understand that. Right. I think but they also know that where they're escaping from. Think about it this way, Ray. We live in a 24/7 world. We live in a world of internet and social media and stuff like that. There's no way that anyone who's trying to cross the border has not heard from somebody. Hey, your kids might get separated. Hey, you might get treated like this. Right? Everybody knows it. Yeah, everybody knows it. And yet people are still trying to come over because they know that in terms of trying to flee the violence and fleeing what we're doing is like that. And so, AOC brings this up, and it's just it's a clear case. Look, the presidential machine is trying to gear up. The GOP's machine is trying to gear up. There's clearly a segment of America who are going to that the GOP is going to use to fundraise this off of, right? And so and also they're going to use
fundraising, but also as a wedge issue with potentially a slice of the Jewish electorate in Florida, or from a fundraising perspective, particularly maybe Jewish donors, what have you. But yeah, it's used as a wedge issue. But the bottom line is that people should be more concerned about why they're uncomfortable with characterizing this, and if we want to wordsmith it, this did not come out of the blue. There's been lots of media, historians, scholars who have been thought leaders in these issues who have been making it clear. This is internment camps. Some have said, including thought pieces in the last few weeks from from Esquire and LA Times, certainly not, extreme rags, that these are indeed concentration camps. Now, you want to debate internment camps. What's concentration camp? The bottom line is we are segmenting a portion of our population who, again, are not violent criminals, and certainly in the case of these children are innocent of any wrongdoing in reality. And we are treating them in an inhumane manner. And so, we don't want to give them soap to use. And so, and the fact that 6 or 7 young people have died in the custody of law enforcement over the last year, speaks to the fact that this is an incredible crisis. And instead of worrying about what we call it, why don't we worry about doing something about it? And the folks that are sensitive to AOC's comments really need to check themselves about what they're really talking about, because to me, it really speaks, besides the political part you just spoke about, it speaks to me, people that are uncomfortable with dealing with the reality of the situation.
No doubt. And I think, I think one of the things that we've seen here is that we have seen some of our progressive Jewish allies step up, right? And the truth is that they have, there has to be a conversation, led, by the Jewish community to really talk about and really kind of, delve into this idea of what's going on, right? Because I do think that, as the evolution of all our communities are going on, you have different thoughts and ideas, different ways of not just embracing history, but also, what does it mean not to forget, right? And what does it mean to also stand up in your community and speak truth to power? And I think there's a lot going on, and it's certainly for another show, but there's a lot going on around, there is no monolithic Jewish community. There is no monolithic, Jewish stance on issues, right? And I think that the truth is that that there is a real, question about how do you discuss or who should be leading discussions around that fine line between, anti-Semitism and criticism, right? And that's not something. That's something that is, it's beyond the third rail. That there's a real, just strictly speaking politically, there's a real danger and real risk in terms of having that conversation. But it's a conversation that has to be had, and it has to be led by the right people.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, not only in the Jewish community, but people that have standing in this conversation from a historical perspective, like George Takei, the actor, who literally was in a Japanese American internment camp, and actually multiple ones. One of the ones, Fort Sill, that's going to be used by these young people in Oklahoma. And so, I think that's someone that certainly has authority in this conversation. And people from the Jewish community, they either were there are still a small amount of Holocaust survivors, but people that really understand the trajectory of what happened, because again, people are losing the historical perspective that, one day people don't just get rounded up. It's, okay, they get rounded up. Can we treat them this way? Can we treat them that way? Can the conditions deteriorate? And again, the fact that people have already died, what else do people need to see? Because if we keep allowing it, maybe there ends up being gas chambers. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. It's consistently happened on the show for several years that I say something and we say something here, LB. Then the mainstream media picks up on it 6 months to a year later. In this case, the only difference is because I've been using words like Nazism, concentration camps, and internment camps from the very beginning of this conversation. You know that you've been with me on these conversations. And so the only difference is that now the mainstream media has picked up on it, and a more famous Puerto Rican says it, and now they're jumping on our ass. And let people forget to, obviously less serious examples like, where did you hear first that Mayor Pete was going to be a player? Right here on this show. And now people are talking about the California, Texas primaries are important. Well, we've been telling you that for quite some time. LB, any final thoughts on this? What do you think sort of in terms of the media? I'm curious, any lessons we should take in terms of how the media covered this issue this week? Because they're certainly not covering the issue, the real issue here, nearly as much as they need to be.
Well, I think that the media, it's June, it's the summer. People are looking for, media folks are looking for for stories, and controversy will always kind of bring this up there. So I think, I think the real issue is what's the lasting effect, right? What's the lasting effect of these things? And I think what the disappointment in my mind when I'm reading about them, some stuff, and look, I think there's a certain amount of fatigue that I think the media is displaying when it comes to these detention centers and these camps and the treatment of folks in terms of because they're kind of getting sick of repeating the same story, right? They are. And it's horrible in some ways there, but that's, in terms of what the media is doing. So the real question is, what is it that we can do? Because every day something else. I mean, there's some really great reporters who are covering some of this stuff that's going on, especially, and we see some of that local reporting here in Miami around the Homestead detention, right? Around, there are reports about sexual abuse that are going on in some of these centers. Again, it reports about even stories that people have snuck out of kids talking about how they're feeling and what they're doing. But in many ways, it's falling on deaf ears, right? And it's falling, and people have to figure out beyond, in some ways, protest. Who is it that isn't standing up that needs to, right? So my thing is like, this issue isn't going away, right? And I'll be fine honest. I mean, next week, we'll talk about this in the show. I mean, there's going to be a whole bunch of a slate of presidential candidates that are going to be down here in Miami. How many of them are actually going to go take the 45-minute drive down to Homestead and see and be willing to have that discussion? I mean, in some ways, the AOC comments really becomes almost a litmus test, not in terms of on her, right? Because she's a badass from the Bronx. Like, she doesn't need anyone to stand up for her, right? But the question is, in light of this, they're going to be so close. Are they going to stop by? Right? Who's going to stop by? Who's going to visit? I mean, there's a bunch of folks who've been camping outside of Homestead, consistently protesting and trying to bring media attention. Are those candidates going to be out there? Are they going to bring some of these other national folks? And what's amazing about AOC's comments is that for all the talk about all the child centers, the treatment of children in these detention centers, there are still a bunch of people who still don't know. I was talking to a local public access media, again, in conversation with a producer. And again, people have kind of heard it, but people don't really know.
They think, I thought that's still happening, right? Or what's the condition?
And they were I heard one kid got, it's now up to 6. And I think it's crazy because I think it's part of this normalization, right? And that's what happens when people are, when things shift so much. I mean, it has been normalized, and that in some ways is where they have won. They have justified, like folks who have justified the treatment and the criminalization, of undocumented, travel. They've been so successful in criminalizing that folks are okay with just saying, hey, I know these conditions are happening, but what can I do? Right? And so people will shut the news off. And so, that's the real larger question, right? Like if this discussion can't get anyone to move, then where are we at?
Well, it's making us move, and we're going to continue to talk about it. It is, and we need to do more, and we're going to have conversations in the coming episodes about more what we can do. You certainly can be calling and contacting your federal officials and let them know you're disgust around this issue. And so, and keep the pressure on these people because, particularly, Republicans, because again, if they don't hear from their constituency any interest in this issue, then that normalcy is going to continue to creep in. So you're listening to Elbert Garcia and Ray Collazo on the Found in Translation radio show on WPPMLP, Philadelphia, 106.5 Philadelphia, and the podcast. And we come back, LB, we're going to hear from Nicole Rodriguez, one of your fellow Floridians. She actually was at the protest to welcome President Trump for his reelection rally down in Orlando a few days ago. And we come back after her interview, LB. We're actually going to talk about some good news that came out of the Big Apple earlier this week. Welcome back to the Found in Translation radio show and podcast. This is your host, Ray Collazo. This week you may have seen that President Trump kicked off his 2020 campaign, even though he literally did that the first days in office. But formally or in 2019, his campaign kickoff, and did it actually in the heart of our community in Orlando, Florida. There was a lot of discussion around how he was either welcomed from supporters and detractors down in Central Florida. And so I wanted to get on the line someone that really sort of is leading the resistance, if you will, in the state of Florida, particularly from a Puerto Rican perspective. Nicole Rodriguez, welcome to Found in Translation Radio Show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Really excited to have you on the show. Nicole has many titles. She's the president of the Hispanic Miami-Dade Caucus down in South Florida, and also the president of the Democratic Puerto Rican Club in Miami. So Nicole's wears many hats, is doing a lot of things. So Nicole, we'll get into some of the politics later in this conversation. But first, you were sort of our eyes on the ground, sort of as part of the counter protest to President Trump's appearance in Central Florida. So can you paint the picture for us, sort of setting the scene, sort of being there, witnessing his presence in Florida the other day at his rally?
Well, we started from Miami. We brought a caravan of around 20 people with 3-4 cars all the way from Miami to Orlando to be part of this protest. When we got there, the little balloon, pretty big, the Trump baby balloon was there. There was different communities represented. You had a lot of Latinos represented, Mexican, Puerto Rican. There were some Dominicans there. We also saw Colombians represented. And of course, the LGBTQ community was also there. We joined the Love Rally that was happening there. It was an anti-protest. And it was basically headquartered in where it was. It's one of the gay bars there.
I think the Stonewall Inn.
Stonewall.
Yeah.
I had it in the tip of my tongue, but yes, the Stonewall bar. So it was really well organized. A lot of people came out. I would say 6,000 to 7,000 people came out to protest. And, talk, listen to music, and show that we are a united community and we're not going to let the hateful rhetoric that this president has instilled in the office of the presidency, which is the highest office that anybody can have. We just decided to repudiate it.
It seemed to me, Nicole, that particularly with your presence and the Mercado family, Assemblywoman, and her father, who's in the state senate, I believe, State Senator Torres, that it was important for a lot of our leadership, particularly from a Puerto Rican perspective, to be there, because there's been a lot of discussion within our community around how President Trump has treated the island in the aftermath of the hurricane, and sort of still the aftermath of the hurricane. So was that a message you wanted to send in Central Florida, particularly around not forgetting around Puerto Rican issues, whether it's on the island or within the diaspora in places like Florida?
Yeah. Well, one of the main communities, the biggest communities of Latinos in Central Florida is the Puerto Rican community. We've been there for more than 40 years, established and very strong. It's now moving towards Miami or South Florida. The Puerto Rican community is building up stronger. We have approximately 1.2 million Boricuas in Florida right now. Out of those, 450 are in South Florida, and we can be registered to vote. We do remember how bad the assistance in the aftermath of the Hurricane Maria was. We still have people in the island living with the FEMA blue tarps for protection from the sun and the wind and the rain. We still have people suffering from the aftermath of the hurricane, and the response of the President of the United States was less than stellar. He boasts that it was a 10 when it would be a -1. It was just very disappointing, and we felt that we were being treated as second-class citizens, and we still are being treated as second-class citizens. So our community is basically joining forces from Central Florida, which is the majority of Puerto Ricans that came here, and now the South Florida. We're joining forces to get that message out. Like, listen, we came here, we've been here for years, and now we're stronger because of how you treated us for Maria. We're going to vote you out. So that was our main message, and we're all united with that message.
Nicole, and we're talking to Nicole Rodriguez, a Democratic political operative in Florida, who runs the Hispanic Miami-Dade Caucus, as well as the president of the Democratic Puerto Rican Club in Miami. We probably have a lot of mutual friends down there, thinking about our friends like Dr. Victor Vasquez, his wonderful wife, Maida Hernandez, and a lot of good leadership down in South Florida. Nicole, did you get to interact? I know it's an odd question, but sort of to give people a sense of the vibe there, was there an interaction between Trump supporters and your group? I know that, there was a lot of, they got a lot of coverage sort of being painted as the Trump supporters sort of a wacky bunch. And they're, they tried to pick out, the few people of color that were there, but there were some. So was there an interaction with Trump supporters, and what was that vibe like being around people that obviously we profoundly disagree with around politics?
Yes, it was surreal, to be honest with you, walking, because we parked close to the Amway Center, and we had to go past all the line that was going towards the Amway, all the Trump supporters that were making a line. And we didn't have any Puerto Rican flags with us because we didn't want people to confuse that we were with them. But what I noticed is the lack of diversity in that line. And we went to where we were headquartered in Stonewall Bar, and we noticed that there was a group of Trump supporters that were trying to get in and trying to cause ruckus. Their shirts were very significant because they were part of the Proud Boys. I don't know if you're aware of this movement. It's kind of like an alt-right sexist movement. They call themselves the Proud Boys, and they're normally kind of a violent group, and they tried to get in. And the police was really responsive, and we appreciate that. We did not try to instigate anything, because the whole point about it is win with love rally. We're not going to be there to instigate any violence or provoke anything. We're just there to support each other and bring a message of love and unity, which is completely opposite to what this president is, instilling in our communities. So, but yes, and unfortunately, his supporters were the ones that, without being provoked, just came to our side and tried, and emphasis in tried, because the police was really, really good at stopping them.
Nicole, and it's not a coincidence that President Trump kicked off a campaign in Florida. Florida will again be the battleground, basically, is a must-win for his campaign to be successful. And of course, we know is famously an airtight electorate. Most state elections are won with sort of less than 0.2% or less than 1% in literally tens of thousands of votes in a humongous state decide these elections. Nicole, what should people know? There's going to be a lot of conversation in the next year and a half around the Latino vote in Florida, the Puerto Rican vote in Florida. So what should people know about the Latino vote in Florida that people aren't talking about or people don't understand, that often gets lost in these national conversations?
We're just not a monolith. We're basically joined together into one need, and then we're not a monolith. We don't have the same needs, all of us together. We do, and especially in South Florida, we do pay attention to what's happening in our countries back home. So it is important for any type of presidential candidate to understand the diversity, to understand what type of message resonates with each and everybody in our communities. What's important to the Venezuelan community is not as important to the Puerto Rican community. However, we do have very similar issues that join us as citizens of the United States. So that's something that the presidential candidates should be able to pinpoint and be able to talk and sit down in a conversation and understand what our needs are back home, our needs are here as citizens, because we do still we're still worried about our people back home, and we want to have enough unity and have enough everything that we can have here. So it is important that we are not pandered to. That's basically what I'm trying to say. And in order for the presidential candidates to actually do something like that is to actually sit down, listen, and just not treat us as one group. It's just it's a diversity. It's complicated, but not so complicated if you come down and listen and be genuine about it. So
I heard
something that's the message that they need to be able to understand.
No, and Nicole, you're hitting the nail on the head. I encourage people listening to this show of the Found in Translation radio show and podcast, whether you're listening to this as a radio show in Philadelphia or as a podcast anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, I encourage people to Google Andrea Mercado from the Florida New Majority just released an op-ed in the New York Times today as we're taping, Nicole, basically saying what you're laying out in terms of, even more beyond the Latino community, people need to progressives, Democrats need to get to Florida now, start talking our community, not just blame Trump in La Última Hora during GOTV in a year and a half. So this is a very dynamic community, a diverse community on many levels, even amongst the Puerto Ricans who have gotten to Florida from a lot of different routes, right? So Nicole, just a final word, really on the Puerto Rican vote in Florida. How are we going to get our people out? I know we have the diversity piece from an ideological perspective, and that's a whole other conversation. I want to engage you in that conversation as we get closer to the election. But just in general, we definitely have a segment of our community that is certainly is aligned with people like you and I on issues, but they just haven't been engaged the way we'd like them to be. So what's the key to getting the Puerto Rican vote out in Florida the way we need to in 2020 and beyond?
Well, I always say that us Puerto Ricans are, very lively people. We love to be warm with each other, have fun. And I just think that we should be making it fun. And we should be able to educate the new people that came here that don't necessarily know about how to vote. So remember, Puerto Ricans only vote every 4 years. And they vote for every seat on the government. So here is different. It's every 2 years at least. And there needs to be education. And how you can make education fun? Well, there's a million ways to make it fun and inspire Puerto Ricans to get involved. Because the only way that we can change our lives here in the United States, as well as our families' lives in Puerto Rico, is to basically get involved. We cannot just vote for every 4 years for a president and not vote for your city councilman or your city commissioner, which affect your livelihood locally. And to vote for become a super voter, you need to be more educated. And to do that and to reach out to our communities, we need to make it fun. We need to educate and make it fun. Because Puerto Ricans love, whenever there's fun, you have a bunch of Puerto Ricans there, first front in line and getting excited. Because we do get excited about elections. 88% in Puerto Rico vote. So we can transfer those numbers here in Florida easily if we make it fun and we educate our people.
I've had a lot of interesting conversations with our mutual friend Jimmy Torres Velez in Central Florida, who's doing a great job promoting the Puerto Rican perspective on politics in Central Florida and really throughout Florida and the diaspora. But we've had a lot of interesting conversations and sat on panels around that same topic. He's very passionate around creating ese ambiente boricua and ese sabor in our political work here. And I think he's you and him are on the right track. Nicole Rodriguez from the Hispanic Miami-Dade Democratic Caucus and the Puerto Rican Democratic Club in Miami. Let people know where they can find you on social media and continue to follow the work you're doing down in Florida.
Yes, you can join the Puerto Rican Democratic Club page in Facebook. And we do have a group. You can find us at DHCS. D as in David, H as in Harry, C as in Cat, F as in Florida, Miami-Dade. You can just find us as a group, join us, and we do have a lot of meetings. We're very active in South Florida. We support candidates locally, so join us and join our fight.
No, I know. We need to definitely highlight with this Puerto Rican Florida conversation, the South Florida community, very dynamic as well. Doesn't get as much attention, but also very, particularly thinking about Broward County, is another huge swing pocket there that we need to continue to cultivate and get people to turn out. Nicole Rodriguez, thank you so much. I teased you when I was confirming you on the interview that our great mutual friend Zoe Colon. I've been trying to get her on the show for years, and she's another great leader. So maybe hearing you on the show will give her a little more animo to join us. But all jokes aside, you're part of a great leadership community that we have in Florida, including Zoe and so many others. So I look forward, Nicole, to I'm glad we connected, and keep fighting a good fight for us down in Florida.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole Rodriguez. You're going to hear Nicole's analysis, particularly around the state of sort of the Puerto Rican electorate and the Puerto Rican vote in Florida in the coming over the next years. And a big part of our population there, including 2 Puerto Ricans that live in LB's household. So, and you'll see WPPMLP 106.5 FM, the Founding Translation radio show and podcast. I'm here with my very special guest, one of my compadres and political analyst in his own right, Elbert Garcia. LB, we don't talk about New York enough on the show, but we had some good news come out of New York State. New York State passed the quote unquote green light bill, which provides opportunity for undocumented residents. The opportunity to get a New York State driver's license is obviously will have a positive impact on public safety and the economy in New York. But there remains a controversy even after being passed by your former boss, Governor Cuomo. So, Elbert, can you give people quickly sort of a historical perspective? This has been a generational issue in New York State. We recall when it became a presidential issue. When Hillary Clinton ran in particular in 2008. But give people a little background about the trajectory you've seen and what's taken over the last 15, 20 years for us to finally get this bill passed in Albany.
Well, I tell you, I think a lot of times people think of New York as a real, kind of bastion of the progressive left and of liberalism. And, obviously it's the home of, it was the, home of Teddy Roosevelt, FDR came out of there, was governor before he became president, and Robert Kennedy was a senator there. So I think a lot of times people think of New York as this big liberal place, and yet the truth is that you have New York City, and New York City itself. Again, this is the same city that elected Rudy Giuliani not once but twice, right? And so it's politics is a very it's a very fickle thing in a place like New York, both in New York City and in New York State. And so I think earlier in the 2000s, we saw a big push and an ability for folks to get undocumented students to get tuition, to get New York State tuition. Everyone thought, okay, this would lead to more benefits and really lead to a realization that we have to treat our undocumented residents, if they're living and contributing to communities both in the city and the state, that we should be treating them just as we would any other community resident. And so, when the Democrats, after being out of power, after the years of George Pataki, came back in power as governorship, one of the first things that they tried to do via, kind of executive order, because they knew that there was this kind of this classic Republican Democrat timeshare in the legislature. They try, Governor then Spitzer try to actually, pass, loosen some of the rules to enable the undocumented to get license, to get a driver's license, right? And no matter how you feel about the issue or what happened, the truth was that he saw a political revolt on his hands. There was definitely dozens of upstate clerks in the the DMV said that they would not follow it, that they would not give it. Almost a similar situation what happened in Kentucky, several years ago, with the woman who refused to give, in terms of to process gay marriage applications. We saw the same thing happen, and the governor then the governor had to actually retreat and actually pull away his suggestion, right? And so that happened in about, I recall right, about early 2000, somewhere between 2006 and 2008. And so to see that change, to go 180 degrees, to see this week the legislature and the governor sign a bill to provide that, really goes to show how far the community has gone, but also the real impact that groups like Make the Road New York, groups like the New York Immigration Coalition have done in terms of organizing, lobbying folks, and in many cases, throwing out elected officials who wouldn't agree to do these things. And again, it was an overnight thing. It took certainly at least a dozen years. I remember even when I was working in New York State government, that even though while the governor in his heart would have wanted to see this a lot sooner, he just didn't have the votes, right? Or didn't feel like he had the political capital to be able to use on this, right? And so the fact that he could that they could all come to the table and do that really kind of shows you where not only where progressives are in New York in terms of being able to decide that they're going to stand on the things that they want to, that they feel like they can believe in, but it also really goes to show just the political power, right, of Latinos and a rising Asian American community who is saying that they are going to stand up for their immigrant parents and their immigrant heritage, and see this as one kind of legacy there. So I mean, honestly, it was great.
So definitely props to the network of activists that have worked on this really for a generation. Thinking about people like, of course, the New York Immigrant Coalition and Make the Road and Lucia Gomez and all of our friends up there that have just done a fantastic job. You said it again. It wasn't just a Latino issue. I think it's the third most spoken language in the New York City public school system is Bengali. After Spanish. I mean, it's a very, very diverse immigrant population that gets impacted by this. The political fallout's been interesting. Like you said earlier, several sort of county elected officials have threatened to not allow driver's licenses to be for people to be able to process immigrants to process their driver's licenses in their county. They'd have to drive a long way to go at that point. And even some of Governor Cuomo's comments this week, I know it's going to go to court. And it's basically putting it on Letitia James, like, well, let's see if the AG can kind of win in court kind of thing. Very typical. He's trying interesting triangulation there, kind of putting it on the black woman to get the job done. But LB, from an organizing perspective, what lesson do you think our people should learn from around the country? Driver's licenses now becomes a hot topic in New Jersey, so the movement is spreading to other parts of the region. But we have these sort of statewide, state politics. Immigration becomes a hot topic. You guys in Florida are going the wrong way when it comes to sort of the rights of immigrants in your state. But for activists out there looking at sort of state advocacy as a tool to advance our movement, what lessons should we learn ultimately from the New York experience?
Well, I think that there are three main lessons that you can draw away. Nothing beats organizing, right? I mean, like at the end of the day, it is about face to face. It is about engaging people. It is about taking a long term, sometimes a longer than you would like term view. I mean, think about it. It's a dozen years. The people who, when this thing started, you might have been in first grade, you might have been in second grade, right? And now you're able now, and now now you might be a high school senior, maybe you're a college senior, and these things are happening now. So we've got to think. We've got to be able not just to organize and put the investment in organizing, creating structures and allowing people to do these multi-year campaigns, but we also have to think in 4D, right? We have to think about from a time standpoint. And I think that's the other thing that New York presents a real good example about, right? That sometimes it's about just staying in the game, right? Sometimes it's about staying, being able to survive long enough to be able to see that door get knocked down. That you just got to keep on knocking until it's knocked down. And sometimes that door is a lot weaker than you think it is, but you still got to keep on knocking it. I think the last thing is what it says is that. Especially when you're working in terms of the political process, you've got to be able to provide. I mean, we are past. We live in I think New York shows that people became very highly sophisticated when they came to their political, to maneuvering and managing political power, right? And this is the one thing that I think that people have to say. Just because you believe something is right doesn't mean that you're going to act on that belief, right? And I think especially my time in New York State politics, I can't tell you the times of conversations that people said, yeah, deep down in my heart, I know you're right, but do we have a vote? Do we have a mechanism? Do we have this? Right?
Yeah, I can't do this. My people don't want it. They always would put it on their voters.
And they'll always do it in terms of that
way. That's what happens on the federal level with immigration, right? Like it's a little different now, but for years, we had moderate Republicans. Even Republicans that kind of understood the world, be like, well, we know this is the right thing to do, but my people, like it's just a lack of leadership. But it goes to organize.
It's a lack of leadership, but it's also, I think what New York folks have done is that they've also not been afraid to wield their power. Right. And I think that's the thing. I think we get into this game where, especially as folks of color and leaders of color, we're told not to exercise our power because by definition, that would not be moderation. Right. Oftentimes to be moderate, right, as a person of color is to not be powerful, or to not be seen as powerful, or to not be seen as expressing power. Right.
Like AOC even running for office, or saying things her truth.
Exactly, right.
Regardless if you believe it.
And so I think that there's this love affair with moderate, with being a moderate, that I think most organizers would say it's not even in the equation, right? It's not about moderation. It's about setting goals and meeting them and creating those kind of things. And so I think that I think being able to it's to say that I think I would guess that the folks who were involved in this are have learned a lot about how the political process works and doesn't work, and I think that's what brings hopefully that's something that we can bring to other parts. I think you're starting to see that in other parts of the country where organizers are not afraid to roll up their I think that I think in the past organizers were much more the task of organizing perhaps certain segments who were historically marginalized or not engaged, no matter how difficult it is, they were much more willing to do that than necessarily roll up their sleeves and have a series of conversations with elected officials or lobbyists and things like that. Right.
Well, yeah, no. And it'll be interesting to see, thinking about the criminal justice reform movement and the sort of tangential or parallel cannabis or marijuana legalization and decriminalization movements. And of course, we didn't get the marijuana legalization bill that we were looking to get out of this session in New York, which would have, literally got a lot of our brothers and sisters out of Rikers. I heard a stat on Sean King's podcast that over 95% of the people that get busted for weed in New York State are people of color. That's incredible. So essentially, in New York State, marijuana is legal for white people. That statistic is incredible. But kudos to our organizers. And again, organizing for social justice is a marathon, not a sprint. So kudos to our friends for a great victory in New York State. We come back, LB. We got a couple days of a lot of hot air in Miami, not just the humidity, but a lot. The presidential debates are coming up, and I know we want to talk about kind of how we see the field. Some interesting things happening in Miami with the Democratic debates. We come back on the Found in Translation radio show and podcast here on WPPMLP, Philadelphia. And you're listening to the Found in Translation radio show and podcast, 106.5 LP, Philadelphia. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast version of the show. You can download again. You can catch us, LB, everywhere. We're going to be on the radio.com app. There's just a lot of Radio Public, a lot of places now you can listen and download Raise Latino Talk podcast. Give a shout out to my homie, my new friend, Joel Berrocal, who's going to be on the show. Berrocal, who's a Philly area Boricua, who's actually the regional president of the Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce here. We were meeting, collaborating. He's going to be on the show very soon. He said that he listens to us on Pandora, which is pretty cool. So you can listen to us on Pandora, Spotify, and we can download the podcast. And I'm here. This is your host, Ray Collazo. You can continue the conversation on social media on Twitter at Ray's Podcast and on Instagram at Ray's Latino Talk. That's RAYS Latino Talk on IG. And Elbert, my co-host for today, Elbert Garcia. Remind people they can find you on social media.
You can find me on social media at Elbert Garcia FL on Twitter. And I'm not yet on the gram yet, but that's coming up that's coming up by the end of the year. I'm trying to fix my stuff there, but still mostly on Twitter and mostly on Facebook. I leave IG for my for my family and my my daughter picks. But the world's changing. The world's changing. So I gotta get on it. I gotta get on it.
Nothing wrong with that. So on our second 20 segment of the show, we talk about, this is the segment of the show we talk about the 2020 presidential elections. Our favorite part of the show, we do this show to support the Love Shouldn't Hurt campaign, which is a campaign which is supporting Latina domestic violence survivors. Cristina Vega, a longtime friend of the show, who's one of our frequent contributors. They're actually having a showing of her documentary, Elbert, on Sunday, June 30th, another showing at 3 o'clock at Aspida High School in Philadelphia, 6201 North 2nd Street. It's the old Cardinal Doherty campus for local folks in the Olney section of Philadelphia. So if you want to see this very poignant documentary, which chronicles the journeys of 3 Latina survivors of domestic violence, including Cristina Vega herself, definitely check out Sunday, June 30th, the screening of her documentary, Love Shouldn't Hurt. And whatever we can to support that movement, we will do so here on the show. So we're stacking 20 years. LB, you are just days away from hosting the first Democratic presidential debate for this cycle. 2 days of jam-packed debating that'll take place for 20 candidates over 2 days. So first of all, LB, what is the vibe in Miami? I know people are hyped up about Copa America, but are people also interested in this upcoming debate? What's the feel like for people as we get ready for the first debate tonight?
I tell you, I mean, I think there's this weird energy of both excitement and of let's put our stamp on this, right? I mean, I think you've got a bunch of different activists and folks who are saying there that want to be involved, that want to be engaged. I mean, I think the problem, these days, I don't know, I've got to go into the forest and refine my optimism, because sometimes my skepticism seems to come up, in ways that even I don't recognize. But, there's, just from an inside baseball standpoint, there's a little bit of a disagreement here. I think a lot of community folks, they were very involved in 2018 in terms of primaries and different debates that were going on when it came to the gubernatorial. I think they thought that they were going to get a similar level of engagement or connection. And the local party didn't make, for example, tickets as readily available for these debates. And so you have a lot of people doing a lot of screening parties and viewing parties. But again, some of these folks were folks who were in the room when some of these debates were going on a couple of years ago for midterms, and now are outside of the room. And so there's a little bit of a feeling of like, let's just kind of wait and see. Hopefully, don't keep us shut out and then come calling to us come November when you want our vote. So there's a little bit of that. These
events, and I've had a little experience doing this. These events, people don't realize the ticket thing is the biggest pain in the butt, because you got to give all the campaigns tickets. And so, because of that volume, that's eating up a lot of space. The media, I don't know if you saw, but that it appeared initially Futuro Media was not going to get a credit, a media credential, but apparently they finally
smartened up. But again, that's classic.
Yeah, well, they got a little heat.
That's classic. And again, some people would say that's NBC. Some people would say, but in some ways, that's classic. Florida Democrats, right? Like that's what that is. I think that's what people get pissed off about. I think that's what that's what makes people worry about Florida in terms of 2020, but that's not what this is about. This is about in terms of these candidates. And so I'm curious, Ray, what's your thought about how these days stack out? When I first heard that we're going to be 2 days, I was like, is this another thing like the Matrix sequel where they had to do it like part 1 and part 2? How's this going to work? How's this whole bilingual thing? I mean, what's your take on how these things break down? And are there any candidates that are particularly that this particular format is advantageous for when it comes to the way they stack it?
Well, let's start here. So this is day 1. So I'm going to read very quickly the names that are going to appear on day 1, which is next Wednesday, the 26th of June. So it'll be 10 on Wednesday, 10 debating on Thursday, the 27th. So day 1 is Booker, Castro, de Blasio, Delaney, Gabbard, Inslee, Klobuchar, O'Rourke, Ryan, and catching. And your starting pitcher is Elizabeth Warren. So I think on day 1, I think clearly to me, the winner of the draw, I think in general, was Senator Warren. It's going to be the first day. She's going to appear like it's going to give her the first opportunity for the national audience to see her, and then she'll look like a front runner. And I think there's a good chance she'll look like the lead dog in terms of her first day, right? So like kind of the pole position of that configuration of people. So I think for day one, definitely Senator Warren to me. This configuration was the most advantageous.
Moving on, so and I hear, I mean, when you hear the names Booker or Rourke, I mean, again, a lot of folks that some people would say maybe more vice presidential material, maybe folks in terms of saying there. I mean, yeah,
it's interesting. I agree. So I think in terms of the sort of who this provides an opportunity to, I think actually it provides a handful of them an opportunity. I think with this configuration, I think, not having a Sanders on stage and not having a Biden in particular, I think this does open the stage for someone with the credentials like a Senator Booker, or even a Governor Inslee or Senator Klobuchar, and even there being potentially enough space for Secretary Julian Castro who I think is probably run as solid a campaign of the mid-tier candidates for sure, particularly on the policy side, to have some space. I don't think there aren't so many dominant personalities in this mix. So I think, if Booker or Inslee, any of these sort of mid-tier or third-tier candidates are going to make any noise, they're going to have a shot because this is not a top-heavy day one.
So who do you think then is silently sulking about their inclusion?
I think the biggest loser of both days, as it relates to the configuration, was Beto O'Rourke. No question about it, because he wanted to be on stage with Biden in making that case, and sort of drawing that contrast. And neither one, frankly, is running on policy. They're running on vision. They're running on profile, and sort of him being an antithesis or an anecdote to sort of old school Biden, right? This is sort of a new school, some would say, poor man's JFK, RFK kind of thing. So the fact that he's got to try to go up and knock off the top, leading candidate of that night, and it's the nerd, and it's the really brilliant woman, Senator Warren. I just think it's like a bad matchup. You know what they say in boxing, styles make fights, and I just think her style is going to be really conducive to sort of minimizing him on the stage. So I think he was the biggest loser of the draw for sure, for both.
So
days.
Wednesday night ends. We got maybe Warren, talking about, everyone, reading Thursday morning, looking up all of her policy proposals because it'll be quoted until then. So heading into Thursday, then into the next day, then who do you see as kind of waiting to who do you see as not being able to wait until this thing begins? Who's really
all right. So day two, the day two lineup: Senator Bennett, Vice President Biden, Mayor Buttigieg, your Senator Gillibrand, Senator Harris, Governor Hickenlooper, Senator Sanders, Congressman Swalwell, Shane Williamson, Andrew Yang, my man Andrew Yang. So I think in terms of
I think he's making. I think either he's from Philly or he's got some Philly connection in there, doesn't he?
Well, I know Hickenlooper's from Philly. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good guy. I looked that up. I know Hickenlooper was born and raised in Philly. But I think in terms of the biggest winner of this night, sort of the antithesis of O'Rourke, I think it's Mayor Pete, because I think Mayor Pete Buttigieg wants to draw that contrast with Biden, especially being the lead dog. Again, one of the people in the best position to make the generational argument. I mean, this is someone that would be amongst one of Biden's younger children, almost a grandchild age, someone of 2 generations removed. And I think he's in the best position of this configuration to create a generational contrast. So I think the fact he doesn't have to compete on the stage with an O'Rourke on the same day and also get a chance to sort of be the yin to Sanders' yang in a debate, I think is the most advantageous for him.
Who's the loser? Who stands to be like, dang, I wish I was Wednesday,
I think it's all the second tier folks. Gillibrand, and I just don't know where she falls into the mix. I just think because this is such a top heavy lineup, I even think Harris may have trouble catching fire. I think in terms of the it's a smaller point, but I think for both Williamson and Yang, who I predict Williamson's going to make some noises to make. You heard it here first. I think Williams is going to catch a little attention. I think both would have preferred to have been split up because they're both the novelty acts. They're not elected officials. Williamson is into Zen. and sort of that old school, almost hippie kind of perspective. And, mindfulness, and then Yang is kind of the science math geek who's got a ton of ideas, sharp guy. I like Yang a lot. So I think I think the media is only going to kind of pick one novelty act. So I think they would have been split up, but nevertheless, I just think there's just not a lot of space for I think Gilbert is just going to be squeezed out, and a few of some of these other second tier candidates. I think people are going to be, especially by the second day, people are going to be really focused on that Sanders Biden potentially Mayor Pete dynamic.
So what do you think? How do you think the race shapes up after? Do you foresee any like campaigns, kind of closing after this first round of debates, or folks saying like, if I don't have this good one, then it's going to be hard, or things like that?
I think so. I think the bigger issue, I don't think anyone will drop out until after the second quarter fundraising comes in. So, basically every quarter, these presidential candidates have to release their fundraising, what they've raised for registration purposes. So, by July 4th weekend, we're going to know more or less what people have in the bank. And so, to run a credible national campaign and to even get to the point where you could get viable in the second set of debates in the fall, you're going to need to have some money. I mean, you don't necessarily need 30 million, but you're going to need, I would think at least 5 million plus to be considered viable and to be able to continue to raise money over the summer and the third quarter. So I think the fundraising totals in terms of getting people to drop out are going to be a bigger factor than the debates. And there is a couple days there for people to get a bump potentially if people see what they like, with a few days before the deadline. But I think, somebody's going to pop. I think the country's going to get reminded of Senator Booker. This is a guy that is incredible political talent. And I think that he has an opportunity to remind people of that. I think people, and even someone like a long shot like a Governor Inslee or Julian Castro, people that are credible candidates, credible political figures, but just for whatever reason have not, caught in spark. I think there's a chance for someone to sort of pop in. I'm sure someone, I don't know who it's going to be. I'm sure someone's just going to completely fall on their face both days and will be sort of ridiculed. They're always, who knows who that'll be. But I think it'll thin out the field, but I think the fundraising totals that we're going to find out a week later are going to do a bigger job of that than the debates itself.
One last question. Obviously, this is Democratic. This is a Democratic debate. But perhaps, we live in different times, right? And so, you're probably going to have our Twitter in chief, trying to lace a couple of different, sound bites, and he says he's going to be live tweeting the debates here. I mean, I don't think I can ever recall a situation where a sitting president was doing that. But on a very serious matter, do you see the GOP? Do you see the GOP reelection effort, maybe being able to get a couple of good hits in while these debates are going in? I mean, how do you see that interplay in terms of the opposite? Because in many ways, the party and these candidates are at their most vulnerable, right, to a certain degree, because they're still trying to find their sea legs, and you've got here someone who's already has it, right? So how do you see that?
Well, that's a big question for the media, and there's been a discussion in the media around what will be sort of the rules of engagement as it relates to covering the president's tweets during the debate and sort of post-debate analysis. So that's going to be a big test to the media in terms of their discipline to allow the candidates to analyze the candidates on face value and not sort of play off, the president's reactions and critiques, because that's sort of empowering him in a way that's really unprecedented in presidential and electoral politics. I will say the other thing on the debates, and actually I have a trivia question for you, LB, as we wrap the segment, is that that it'll be interesting to see on the content, what kind of content from a Latino voter perspective that we get. We have Jose Diaz-Balart that's going to be one of the several, questioners. It's going to be televised simultaneously on Telemundo. But beyond, them sort of simultaneously putting Spanish translations on the audio, are we going to hear real substantive questions around, to our point around immigration? The island of Puerto Rico, still a major issue. Are we going to hear about Venezuela, Latin American policy, People like Julian Castro put out some very thoughtful policies around to address this ongoing crisis happening in Central America, sort of a Marshall Plan for this era. So I'm very curious to see what are the quality of the questions and the quality of the content from a Latino perspective that are asked for. And of course, the biggest issue when you poll Latinos consistently is healthcare. So beyond the more obvious Latino issues, prescription drug prices, access to affordable healthcare, quality healthcare in language and culture. So it'll be interesting to see if we have some substance from the questioners because, having conversations around, are you a democratic socialist? Are you a capitalist? Are you this? Are you that? I think, we need the moderators to come through. I just hot off the presses, LB, I got a trivia question for you. Univision just released their poll around Latino voter preference at this point for the Democratic nominees. I've got the top 6 here, brother.
Look at that.
So I'm going to give you a trivia question, brother. Top 3. I'm going to give you the 3 and then the numbers. Well, let's do this. Let me give you the top 6 and then the numbers. And you go tell me the order, and let's see how many of the 6 you get right. So of the top 6, one is at 21%. The other is at 20%. Third place is at 9%. Then 8%, 7%, 6%. So they're all bunched up. But basically the top 1 and 2 is essentially a tie, 21 and 20. And then the other 4 are between 6 and 9. So give me the, who do you think quickly are that top 6?
Well, in no particular or in a round, but give
me the order.
I think you got Biden leading among Latinos. I'm gonna say Biden leading among
Latinos. You are correct. He is at 21%. You are correct.
And then I'm gonna say Bernie comes in second.
Bernie Sanders. You are absolutely correct, brother. 20%. This is very interesting.
Comes in second. I think, and I'm trying to think about in terms of everybody else. So I think Castro's in there. I think Julian Castro is in there in terms of the.
Wow, you're on this, LB. Julian Castro, third at 9%. You are absolutely correct.
There you go. Right.
You got 3 more. Well, let's get to it. I think the main thing here is fourth is Beto at 8%, which sort of makes sense, right?
Texas and things like that. The real question is there a woman? The question is there a woman? And this is
that's what we're getting to. So Beto was 4, and then Elizabeth Warren at 7.
I was going to say Elizabeth.
Kamala Harris at
6. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's interesting because that shows
California.
But it's interesting because you have 2 Texans that get 17% total, and the Californian only gets 6%. So that, to me, what I read into this is, A, Bernie Sanders has support in the Latino community. No question. I mean, if he's at that level, that to me shows there's some support now. Is that name recognition? I think there's definitely a generational flavor because all the Latinas I know under 25 years old were Bernie, 100%. I also think this shows in a weakness that has not been talked about enough with Kamala amongst Latinos. I mean, the woman is the senator from California, and you have 2 Texans that are getting 17% of the electorate, and the California senator, who's the only West Coast person, only gets 6. That to me shows a weakness and an opportunity for the other campaigns, particularly I think Julian, Beto, and even a Bernie, and maybe even a Biden to make some inroads in California. And this also shows Elizabeth Warren definitely has some work to do in the Latino community. You're listening to Elbert Garcia and Ray Collazo on the Found in Translation radio show and podcast. As we wrap up this edition of the show, I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about, for a second, the ongoing drama. Bochinche.
Te lo digo, man.
Unbelievable. So let's quickly go through it. Of course, our love and our prayers. I mean, we love this man, Big Papi. We have a great mutual friend who's a very close personal friend of Big Papi, Dario Collado. Dario's been keeping us posted on a personal level. But needless to say, this is someone that gets nothing, despite my baseball affiliations. As a Fighting Phils fan, nothing but love and admiration for this brother, David Ortiz. So first of all, we want to make sure he's safe and healthy and happy and is going to be back with his family full strength very soon. But beyond that, it went from their mistaken identity. Then it went to he bought a Lexus for La Mujer, the big drug cartel guy. Now the authorities are saying mistaken identity. People are saying that's BS. I mean, even the Blancos in the mainstream don't believe that. And now one of our other Dominican contacts who remain nameless, who's in the baseball world, the theory that's now being accepted by many people in the Dominican Republic, is that this was a hit led by the government so that the big cartel guy who the U.S. wanted to extradite would not go because the government had something to do with it. I mean, LB, this is getting very complicated.
I mean, as one of our friends said, this is almost like, JFK's assassination. Like, you don't know, and it's almost a combination of like JFK. Remember that Seinfeld episode with Keith Hernandez, and like, I mean, we joke around and say, but on a very serious note, like, this goes to show what the hell is going on. That being said, too, it's also happening in this context where you are seeing increased media attention around these deaths of American tourists, a lot of which are folks of color, right? That are dying at these these vacation spots that people usually go visit and have unlimited drink and food and stuff like that and have great times. And it's one of these real interesting things about media cycles and attention, because it's not like you're still the death rate and the robbery rates in terms of NDR is still no more different than they were before. They're not higher, and in fact they're higher, in the mainland in the United States, right? And
you can listen to your analysis of that situation on last week's show, so people can backtrack. But very quickly,
it's still going. I guess what I'm saying is that it's still going on.
It's all crazy, but just getting back to David Ortiz for a second. I mean, I guess all of it sounds ridiculous to me, but I could kind of believe any of it. So I just don't know what to believe at this point, because it seems incredible to me that someone could think, A, he can get away with it. He was immediately apprehended. So why would anyone even do this for $8,000? I mean, what it came down to, right? And I mean, it's just obviously he didn't really mean to kill him, because he shot him in the safest place to do it, in his stomach. He had plenty of time to hit him in the head. So I just don't understand any of it. It makes no sense fundamentally.
This clearly wasn't a contract professional killer either, right? I mean, let's also be real, right? I mean, shoot. I mean, Dad. I mean, I'm not gonna say anything about my people and be stereotypical, but like, man, like, we know how to kill people. I mean, come on now. I mean, come on.
Yeah, well, they're already gone.
Come on now.
Wasn't your dad in the Dominican Navy?
I can't really talk about my family dynamics here, but the point is that all I'm saying is that we know how to kill people. Okay, like this is not clearly, it's like some professional job, or it's one of these things where it's just like, coño, el valor de la gente, like you can't find them like you used to, I guess. I don't know. Like, I mean, seriously, but the thing is, it does bring about, on a very serious tip, mira, la cosa, things are desperate down in terms of our countries, right? And I said this last week too. I mean, things are desperate in our countries. We have circumstances, situations that are going on. Things that, norms that didn't exist before, not the norms that didn't exist, but like, people are on edge. People will do a bunch of things for money these days. Did he realize it was Big Papi at the last second and then kind of not shoot? Who knows, right? I don't know, right? Can I believe that the DR government, would do such a thing? I mean, it's not a crazy thought. I mean, most people would say like, that sounds plausible, right? That's the problem. The problem is this sounds plausible.
But it sounds ridiculous, and none of it makes sense for so many levels. But again, we'll continue to pray for, again, not only Big Papi, but the people that have been hurt at these resorts. I mean, who knows what's going on there? Could be a lot of reasons. There's all kind of speculation around there being conspiracies around that maybe, there's other islands or other tourist destinations that are trying to distract from the great success that Punta Cana has had in driving vacationers to that wonderful island.
Look, I read somewhere that a couple of months ago, Trump was restarting some investments there and stuff like that too. I mean, there's just a lot of things in play. It's crazy. It's crazy, and everything has a modicum of the truth. Everything has a modicum of the truth, and so that's the hard thing. But it's a lot of craziness going on. I will say you this though. I'm telling you, this is a real ripe opportunity though. I think Oliver Stone, the folks, our folks at Latino Out Loud podcast, Juan Bago, a couple of these Latino folks. I mean, I think you got a really good novela you can make. Just based on the situation. God. You know,
I know.
Jesus Mero, gets in, right? A couple of things. I'm telling you,
there's a mockumentary here on the offing. Well, Elbert Garcia, again, thank you so much for joining this edition of the Found in Translation radio show and podcast. We always say, we'll do a half hour, and we did an hour. But that's all right. We're giving people a lot of good information here. And again, I want to thank Nicole Rodriguez for joining the show as well, sort of being our correspondent at the Trump protest from his rally in Florida early this week. Elbert, we'll talk after. We need to do something. I'm thinking Facebook or something. We need to do something live after the debates.
Definitely.
Even if it's a quick thing on social media, give people an update. And we'll be. I know we're going to be watching these debates and what's happening in the coming days very closely. Thank you, Elbert Garcia, for joining me on the Found in Translation radio show and podcast. And thank you so much for the WPPM 106.5 FM family, and have a wonderful weekend.